Okay, everybody, welcome back to our videos. It's been little while since we've watched one, so what we're going to get into today is really discussing the ideas of what happened to Africa. And we're going to do this in a couple different parts, and we're also going to combine that showing how kind of the decline of Africa led to the basis of more modern day issues. Now, really, one of the things that is going to put Africa en route to doom, if you will, is when the Europeans discover the New World. Of course, this was really established by Christopher Columbus, and yes, we can debate other people that got here first, but the fact of the matter is with Christopher Columbus's landing in the New World, the entire world was changed. The Europeans, once they realized exactly what they had over here, and if you look here, lots of Europeans were here. You have the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French when we're looking at the map over here where I'm circling with the mouse. And there was a tremendous European presence here. And what they saw the Americas for was going to be an opportunity to simply make money and make money on agricultural goods. And that is when you really have the development of the plantation. The plantation was going to grow things like sugar and cotton and tobacco and other crops that really weren't for consumption but were for sale. And the Europeans are going to make a ton of money, and this is going to put the Europeans in a position that they had never been before, which we're going to talk about, to dominate the world. The problem that they had is that they needed labor. Now, they did start to use Native Americans for this for a while, but eventually what started to happen is that those Native Americans converted to Christianity, or many of them married Europeans, so it really wasn't a cool thing to do that to them anymore. And so then what happened is that the Europeans were looking for cheap labor for their plantations, and they would find it in Africa. And of course, it is at that point that we have the development of the slave trade. It is referred to often as Mafa, or the Great Disaster. That is, Mafa is a Swahili word, and it was the Portuguese that were the ones that developed this primarily. And as you can see, they came from what was over here, if you look at the map, the Slave Coast, from modern-day Angola on the bottom to the Congo, up to Sierra Leone, and here you have Benin and Togo and Niger and the Ivory Coast and modern-day Senegal. And they were primarily going to South America. Actually, the vast majority of slaves, as you can see here, went to the West Indies, okay, in the Caribbean, the islands, or to Brazil. And they were going to grow crops, again, like tobacco and coffee and cotton and sugar. They would mine silver and gold, and they would also grow rice. We have anywhere from, as you see on the map, it says 10 to 15 million people were transported, I should say, across. Conservative numbers have it about 12 million, and anywhere from 2 to 4 million people were killed just coming over to the Americas. Now, the slave trade was pretty awful, and you talked about it a lot in US 1, but when we look at the long-term impacts of the slave trade, one of the big things here is we have the development of racism, discrimination, and stereotyping. The idea that the Caucasian or white race, if you will, is superior to that of the African or the black race, as it's often referred to, comes from this time. That the Europeans rationalized that since they were able to enslave the Africans, they were better than the Africans, and Africans are less intelligent, that Africans are more prone to violence, that every possible stereotype, every possible racist thing that you've ever heard in your entire life has its foundation in this period. Okay, and you see here the slaves on the right who are kept in chains, and you have the diagram of the Middle Passage. But that, in my opinion, is probably the biggest negative impact of the slave trade, is that we have racism because of it. And it's led to so many different problems. You look at current problems in the United States today, you look at problems across the world, and the slave trade is where it started. Now, slavery eventually is going to end, and many nations will outlaw it. Of course, the United States fights a civil war over it. But as I have here, Africa still has a lot of stuff. If you look at the map on the right, look at all the things. It's got cocoa for chocolate and coffee and corn and cotton and dates and other fruits and palms and rice and peanuts and especially rubber. And for years, though, the Europeans were a little bit nervous about going into Africa. Most of the interior Africa was never mapped, they didn't know it was there. And that would change with a journey by a guy by the name of Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. David Livingstone was a kind of like a sociologist, and he was a naturalist, and he wanted to find out more about Africa. So he travels into the interior of Africa. He's given credit, for instance, for discovering Victoria Falls and a lot of other areas, and basically his work, when it gets back to Europe, shows that there's lots of stuff in Africa to be had, and so the Europeans decide that they're going to change things up. What they're going to do is take over Africa. They are going to occupy it, and are going to conquer it. Therefore, they don't have to use slaves, if you will, anymore. Okay. Slowly but surely, the Europeans are taking chunks of Africa here, there, and in other places. However, what that resulted in is that the Europeans were starting to come into conflict with each other. There were some violent conflicts, there was the possibility of war, and so in 1884, they have something known as the Berlin Conference. England, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain will all come together, and what they are going to do is divide Africa up between them. By dividing up Africa, they are going to give everybody kind of an equal opportunity to use or take the resources of Africa. They are going to avoid conflict. What's crazy, though, if you think about this, look, there's not a stretch of Africa except for Ethiopia, which I'll explain in a minute, that wasn't conquered by the Europeans. And the fact of the matter is that they did it in a boardroom with basically a big map on the table, and they drew some lines. The Africans none the wiser. Now, we'll be getting into why they were actually able to accomplish this, but this is a key moment, and this is the moment that if you look at a lot of the problems in Africa, it is this colonization period that is going to be the basis for it. Now, Ethiopia was the only nation left alone because they were Christian, which is going to be a really big deal, and two, the Italians actually try to conquer Ethiopia, but they are defeated. But aside from Ethiopia, everything else is going to be taken over by the Europeans, and as I said, it's going to cause the basis of a lot of problems moving forward. Okay. Now, in the end, as we're going to see, and we're going to be getting into what is going to be occurring long term, but we can see a lot of the basis of everything that we've had happen in the world either occur due to the slave period, which we're going to be talking about some issues with moving forward as well, or the colonization period. So let's make sure, I want you to write a few comments down tonight, make sure you write your questions, and then we'll talk about it tomorrow.